Hello, I'm Casper Craven, and a very brief overview of my journey to date. I started off in life as an entrepreneur. I've also worked in large companies. I've built and sold businesses. But perhaps more interestingly, I've sailed twice around the world. The first time competitively on the world's toughest yacht race. The second time with my wife and our 3 young children. And for the last 7 years, I've been writing books, researching and exploring what does it take to be able to achieve big, bold goals. Those things that everybody else says it's impossible, there's no way you can do that, which I think is one of the most important skill sets that we need in business today. In my journey, I've experienced lots of different leadership, and I think leadership is so nuanced that we need to take things from different people. I've worked with leaders who are very kind, caring, compassionate, and there's absolutely a place for that. That's fundamentally important. I've worked with leaders who are hard driving and absolutely driven for the numbers, and there's a piece for that as well. And I've also worked with leaders who have great humility and accept that they don't have all the answers and are prepared to be able to experiment and find their way forward. And I think leadership these days needs little elements of all those different things. So, across all the people I've worked with, there's been so many different things, and I think it's about forming the right blend of leadership for each person. Today's business world, I believe, is very, very different from anything that it's been in the past. I hear it often called the exponential age, and I believe that the exponential challenges we face today, we cannot solve with linear thinking. I think we need to think very, very differently about the challenges we've got in front of us. So what are some of the traits that we need to have for that? I think the sense of humility. One of my favourite writers, Ray Dalio, he said everything changed for him when he went from saying, I'm right, to how do I know I'm right? And I think that's so powerful, that humility to accept that we don't have all the answers in this fast changing world. I also think to think like a scientist and to say, what are the different experiments that we need to run? Because nobody knows what that future looks like. So how can we run those experiments as quickly, as fast, as cheaply as possible so we can iterate our way towards the future? And I think one of the other notions that I have is this whole notion of nurturing people, of building people up, because every single person in your team has a unique contribution and part that they have to play. So I think that so much it's like thinking like a farmer, and then it's all about planting seeds and the encouragement and the nurture to help each person to be the very best that they can be. So I think it's a combination of some of those different things, that humility, that experimentation, and that really growing of people. One of the questions that I hear a lot is how do we encourage our leaders to embrace change rather than protecting the status quo and what we have today? For me, one of the ways that I lean towards this is the quote from McKinsey that came out in 2023, which is the pace of change will never be this slow again. So it's encouraging people to look at the changes that are happening in the marketplace and to look forwards and imagine your business in 5 years, 10 years time. What are the patterns? What are the trends? What are the changes? What does that ecosystem look like? And to build around that business of tomorrow rather than just looking at the business of today. One of my mentors always used to say to me, if you plan to be in the business that you're in today, in 5 years' time, you won't be in business. So for me, it's having that mindset to say, how do we disrupt ourselves before somebody else disrupts us? And for me, it's all about getting on that front foot and encouraging people to think like that. And for me, it's very much about leading by example and encouraging those ideas, that diversity of thinking, to get people to imagine what that story looks like, and then of course to start to take the steps towards it. But I don't think we can afford to be complacent, to be asleep at the wheel. We have to seize this moment and say, what does that future look like, and then go and make it happen. So what are some examples of strong leadership that we need to be able to tackle the challenges of today? For me, I think it's that sense that our leaders need to be comfortable saying, you know what, I don't have the answers. I don't know what the future looks like. And then to share that challenge with the team, with the group, and say, what are the best ideas that we've got on how we're going to go and fix this together? I think there's an old-fashioned mindset which says, the leader has to have the answers and has to rock up saying, I've got the answers to this. I think the strong leader has the humility and that sense of presence to say, I don't know what the best answer is. And that sense with Ray Dalio when he said, Everything changed for him when I went from saying I'm right to how do I know I'm right. It's turning around to your team and saying these are the challenges, these are the existential threats that face us as a business. How will we deal with that? What are the best ideas? It's only when we work together and we tap into all that brilliance that we can actually solve those challenges of today. That to me is what strong leadership looks like. So what are some of the best strategies to develop emerging leaders in your organizations? Look, I work on a lot of high performer programs with inside organizations, and some of the skills that we really lean towards developing are all around what I would say is listening skills. Really listening to yourself, what's going on for you. Self-awareness is such a key thing. There was a statistic from Harvard Business Review in 2018 that of 5,000 senior leaders surveyed, only 10 to 15% of them were self-aware, which is quite horrendous when you think about that. So it's having that listening to yourself, being self-aware, what's going on for you, understanding how you operate as a human being. It's a listening to those people around you in your team, understanding what's going on for them. People only do things for their reasons, not for your reasons. And as a leader, it's so important to step into their world and really understand that. And of course, it's listening to your marketplace. What's happening? What's changing in your marketplace? So I think for me, that skill of listening is such a crucial one for our leaders of today, to spend time on that. I think there's an associated skill as well though, and that for me is around developing resilience. Because we don't know what the future looks like, because we have to run lots of different experiments to iterate our way forwards, we're going to fail a lot of times. And it's changing our relationship with failure, it's changing our relationship with resilience. I believe that resilience is far too important to be left to chance. So one of the things that I always encourage for emerging leaders is to say, what are the things that you can do to deliberately, specifically, and consciously increase your levels of resilience? Because only when we do that I think we can deal with the challenges that we're facing today. You know, one of the stats that I see is that over a quarter of the workforce are experiencing burnout right now. Perhaps you know someone who's experiencing that. Perhaps you've experienced some challenges around that. For me, this is this notion of resilience, and there's many different ways to develop it, but it's finding out for you what are those best things that you need to do to develop that. So listening and resilience are two of the core skills that I always encourage leaders, actually at all levels, not just upcoming leaders, but at every level inside a business. So one of the things that I see when we're going after big, bold goals is that because we don't know what that future looks like, the conflict is absolutely guaranteed, but the resolution of that conflict is optional. And for me, paying attention to the tools which can help us to resolve that conflict are so important. So one of the questions I always ask people in my talks is this notion about past, present, future. Where do you spend most of your time looking? Is the past, the present, or the future? And I get people to put numbers on that. Then I get people to compare that with other people in the room. Why do I do that? It's a tool for self-awareness, for understanding yourself. It's a tool for understanding other people, because we all see the world differently. You know, we have this inbuilt sense of sort of, you know, I see the world this way, therefore everybody else must see the world this way as well. And for me, that's one of those core building blocks of why we have conflict, because we don't appreciate the views and the perspectives of other people. So firstly, understanding that everybody sees the world differently, understanding that people only do things for their reasons, not for your reasons, is the starting point. And then after that, it's asking questions, it's listening, it's paying 100% attention to the person in front of you, and not sort of sitting there thinking, well, what am I going to say next? It's genuinely understanding and appreciating their world. This applies to literally everything where there's any conflict, because only when we get down to that level of detail that we can start to appreciate that. So for me, that's the building block for how we start to address challenges, how we start to work through that. There's many more skills and tools that sit behind that, but it starts with that understanding piece. So what are some of the critical challenges that face our leaders today? Look, I think it's quite hard to avoid the sort of incredibly fast-changing nature of the world that we live in. The fact that when you hear about AI all the time, that's coming in to disrupt us. We see in every single market there are nimble renegades coming in to disrupt how the big boys are doing things, and so that's forcing change. Layer on top of that the challenges around our mental health, the changing way our society and culture engage with information, social media, those sorts of things. There are lots and lots of different challenges, and it feels like there's so many things coming at us the whole time. So if that's the backdrop, how do we deal with that? For me, I come back to this notion of we have to go out into the future, and I think we have to create the pole star in the future by where we're going towards, rather than the pole star about why we're great because of where we are today. So it's looking out there, it's creating your anchor, it's creating your certainty about something that you're heading towards. Then I think it's having those traits of the humility, of the experimentation, of sort of encouraging people in your team to start coming up with the different ideas about how do we do that. And I think it's about that iterating step by step towards that pole star in the future. I think that's the only way that we can really effectively deal with all those different challenges that we're facing right now. So one of the big challenges I see is how do we develop that culture of innovation inside organizations, because I think that's so important, because unless we have that fresh flow of ideas, we're not going to be able to solve those hard challenges in the future. So there's various ways I think we need to think about this. One of the ways I think is encouraging the fact that it's just that sense of experiments. A lot of them are going to fail, but they're going to go and teach us a powerful piece of information. So it's having that culture right from the top down to say, well, what experiments have you run this week? What have you learned from that? Fascinating business I met some years ago. It was a company that specialized in doing insurance for small businesses for 1 to 10 employees. And they grew, I think it was from about 10 million to about $500 million before they were sold. And the CEO of the business set it up so that they could continually run experiments, iterate their way forwards. They had a really clear mission statement, they had a really defined set of values which they truly lived, but they ran about 60 different data experiments every single week. And it's just like, well, anyone has an idea, great, well, let's find a way to test it quickly and easily. Because what happens right now, I think, in a lot of organizations, someone has a great idea and they talk themselves out of it by the end of the day, think, oh, that will never work. But it's about capturing those 1% ideas. Well, there might only be a 1% chance that it might work, but actually if you take a whole bunch of those, some of them will work. So how can we create a culture that allows that rapid experimentation to give us that insight so that we can start to move forwards? That for me is the single best way to create that culture of innovation. So look, for me, one of the big challenges around creating effective teams to be able to tackle those challenges you're facing out there in the future is how do we communicate effectively together? And I think that so much of this goes back to that effective listening piece. To take the time to really step into somebody else's world, understand exactly what they're saying. One of my pet hates is when someone's halfway through a sentence and someone assumes they already know what they're going to go and say, and then they go off on something because they've assumed that. It's like, stop, just listen. And then once you've heard something, play it back and say, this is what I heard. Did I hear you correctly? By the way, that single thing, by the way, helped turn my marriage around. So it's very, very powerful at home as it is at work. It doesn't matter where you develop these skills, but effective communication for me starts with that listening piece. Listening to the problem, listening to the world, what's going on there, and then listening to the different ideas in the people in your team, and then understanding. That key part of that communication piece, understand what is the brilliance of every single person on your team, because each person on your team will have unique contributions. So often I see teams where we don't really know who's in the room, we don't know what their specific expertise is. I do this thing called superpowers, where you get each person to understand by a very human process, what is the thing that each person is uniquely brilliant at. And once they understand that through this very human process, then we have conversations around the team, say, actually, you know what, I'm really good at doing this thing here. And somebody says, oh, I'm really good at doing this thing here. And so there's so many light bulb moments. It builds trust, it builds engagement by really understanding what each person is amazing at doing. And then once you have that piece of knowledge, when you have problems in the future, you know exactly who to go to. We don't do that very often, do we? We're just like, oh, here's the problem, let's just dive straight into it. Oh, well, you're in finance, you're in marketing, you're in product. Oh, well, let's just work on that basis. But it's understanding the skill sets that people have. Oh, you're really good at problem solving. Oh, you're really good at building relationships. It's a deeper understanding of the different contribution that each person can play. This, for me, sits right at the heart of the communication, as knowing who's in the room and what they can contribute and how to get the best out of them.